The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the entire world was never the same again. This event marked the end of World War II and resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. However, some people defend this action, arguing that it was necessary, as otherwise the war would have continued, causing even more suffering. The end justifies the means. Why did they choose Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And why do they say Oppenheimer was the father of the most destructive weapon ever used on humans? Well, to give you some context, it's the midst of World War II. Nazi Germany is in a deadly race against the United States to create the most powerful weapon of destruction so far, the atomic bomb. The race for this weapon is fought between two individuals. On one side, Werner Heisenberg, a highly brilliant German theoretical physicist. The problem is that if he succeeds, the atomic bomb will fall into the hands of the Nazi Party, and Hitler will be unstoppable. On the other side, Robert Oppenheimer, another theoretical physicist who is a professor at a university in the United States. He is an ambitious man with a strong character who loves to smoke. Both discover that atomic fission is possible and, therefore, theoretically, nuclear weapons are possible as well. So both sides get to work. However, Germany takes the lead as Heisenberg discovers fission first, and the Nazi Party invests millions in the development of this new bomb. Heisenberg wastes no time and begins experiments to see if it is possible to create this new weapon. Despite this, initially, the United States doesn't pay much attention. In fact, everything indicates that it is going to lose this race until a man arrives to change the course of history. His name is Albert Einstein, the most famous physicist of all time. He was the man who warned President Roosevelt about Hitler's plans. But how did Einstein know about Germany's plans? Well, a colleague named Leo Szilard learned through an article published by the Germans that they had achieved nuclear fission. Neither Einstein nor Szilard was sure they would use it to make a bomb, but deep down, they were certain. So Einstein himself wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, warning him of the immense danger the world was in. The president understood and took action. This is how, together with General Leslie Groves, he launches one of the most ambitious projects the world has ever seen, the Manhattan Project. However, for this project to take off, one thing is needed: a man to lead the scientific part of the mission. The project needs someone intelligent, cunning, and capable of coordinating many people. The right person for the job is Robert Oppenheimer. Groves goes to the university to offer him the reins of the project. Oppenheimer is an extremely ambitious man who wants to leave his mark on the world. He is the right man, as he knows exactly what needs to be done. So despite never having led anything larger than seminars or classrooms, he agrees and decides to take on the mission. They need a place away from civilization and with plenty of space, so Oppenheimer convinces Groves to set it up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. This place has the ideal conditions, but also holds sentimental value for Oppenheimer, as he spent time there in his youth. They call upon the brightest scientists and minds of that time, along with their families, so they can be close. The project grows at an impressive speed, employing over 130,000 people and costing almost $2 billion. On the other hand, the Nazis begin to have problems as Heisenberg's laboratory suffers a couple of accidents and Germany starts facing issues on its war fronts. However, a tragic event accelerates the U.S. project: the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan was trying to expand into the Pacific. However, American troops were hindering their expansion, so Japan decides to take action and launches a surprise attack to try to destroy this American base. It was a terrible day for the United States. More than 3,500 men died or were injured, not to mention all the lost planes and ships. Japan hoped that the United States would not retaliate. However, the U.S. government declared war on them, and the consequences for Japan were much worse than they ever imagined. Despite the difficulties of the Nazi army and the Germans, along with Heisenberg, also making significant strides, they were getting closer to achieving nuclear weapons. However, in May 1945, the Germans surrender in Europe, and Heisenberg, along with the other scientists involved in the project, is captured. There was no need to use the bomb against Germany, and the Nazi army ceased to be a threat. However, Japan had not surrendered yet. So the goal changed. The United States was determined to create the weapon that would end the war. This is how, just 3 years after the official creation of the Manhattan Project, the world's first nuclear bomb is completed and ready to be tested. Finally, the day of truth arrives, the first test of a nuclear bomb ever made in history. With this, they will know if all the effort was worth it. Oppenheimer, who was a lover of poetry, decides to name this test the Trinity Test in honor of a poem that speaks of destruction as a way of creation. A giant ball made of steel is hoisted onto a tower about 100 feet high for the final test. Everyone is nervous. No one is 100% sure it will work. Some scientists fear that the power might be so much that it could ignite the atmosphere, or that the radiation could affect their skin, so certain individuals choose to wear sunscreen. The cameras start recording this iconic moment, and the countdown begins. Despite being more than 6 miles from ground zero, many scientists and military personnel wear protective lenses, as the emitted light can be so intense that they could be temporarily blinded. Finally, on July 9th, 1945, at 5:30 in the morning, the entire world changed forever. First, a strong flash, followed by a powerful wave of heat, ending with the shock wave. It completely vaporizes the steel tower and turns the sand into glass. The explosion is a success. Oppenheimer and General Groves achieved it. Upon seeing the explosion, Oppenheimer thought of a phrase he read from a Hindu sacred text, which he revealed in an interview years later. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." As a curious fact, unfortunately, Oppenheimer would end up dying in 1967, at the young age of 61, from throat cancer due to his tobacco consumption. Returning to the story with everything tested, they built the Little Boy bomb, which is about to become the first atomic bomb to be used against other human beings. This, brought from San Francisco aboard the USS Indianapolis, is transported for 10 days to an island called Tinian, a very strategic place because the island is only a 6-hour flight to Japan. Among them is the man who is about to drop the first atomic bomb in history, the plane's pilot, General Paul Tibbets. They talked about it in a very discreet manner, and even if you knew, it was always better not to ask questions. The main target, Hiroshima, but more specifically, this T-shaped bridge. The night before, they gather the entire team to explain the mission. They can drop it on 3 targets, but the main one is Hiroshima. Then they tell them that this is the most powerful destructive weapon ever created. When it explodes, the ashes and smoke will create a mushroom-shaped cloud, followed by a bright light brighter than the sun itself. Finally, they tell them that using this weapon will end the war, at least 6 months earlier than expected, saving a lot of pain and suffering. However, this is far from reality. Before leaving, Paul Tibbets names the plane after his mother, Enola Gay. He loads the bomb onto the plane, gives them a final explanation, and cyanide pills. This in case they fall into Japanese hands. That morning is different, as before boarding, there were many cameras photographing the moment. Almost no one on the crew knows, but this group is about to change the course of humanity forever. With everything ready, they take off on the mission. A reconnaissance plane that takes off earlier informs them that the sky is clear, and they can proceed to Hiroshima. But why this place? This decision was made by the Target Committee, but not for the reasons you think. General Leslie Groves established 4 criteria to decide the place, each one more perverse than the previous. These were 1. That the place had sentimental value for the Japanese, 2. to have some military objective like factories, concentrations of soldiers, or warehouses. 3. To be intact to see the real power of the bomb's destruction, and 4. To be large enough to appreciate the weapon's capacity. However, the final decision had nothing to do with that. When the committee met at the Pentagon, they agreed that it didn't have to fall on military installations or factories, but on the heart of the city, on an intact urban area to demonstrate its military power. Whether it hit ammunition factories or troops no longer mattered. If that were the case, they would have chosen other cities with more arsenals or weapon depots, but no. The real target of the attack was the city itself. The real objective was the psychological damage to an entire nation. The committee didn't even try to warn or threaten the Japanese government by showing them the New Mexico test. After 6 hours of flight, the Enola Gay reaches the target, and the atomic bomb is dropped on the city. Records indicate that it was approximately 45 seconds in the air before exploding. The total destruction radius was 1.6 kilometers around, causing fires and literally melting people who were nearby. It is extremely shocking that you can still see their shadows on the floor and walls of some parts of the city. It is believed that about 100,000 people died on the day of the explosion. Half an hour later, dust and ashes rained down with highly radioactive particles, causing even more deaths and radiation-related illnesses. Despite such devastating destruction, Japan did not surrender. This was mainly due to the lack of knowledge their government had about the destructive magnitude of nuclear power. They did not understand the capability that the United States now had in its hands. So the U.S. government decides to deliver another heavy blow with the second nuclear bomb. This one was called Fat Man and was slightly more powerful than Little Boy. But this time, it was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, ending the lives of more than 880,000 people and reducing the city to rubble, dust, and ashes. This second strike was enough for Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The day the surrender was signed was a day full of joy, as the war had finally ended. On September 2, 1945, a ceremony takes place on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ship is filled with hundreds of sailors, reporters, cameramen, and high-ranking military officials, representatives of Allied nations, and the Supreme Allied Commander, General Douglas MacArthur. At 9 in the morning, Japanese representatives approach the ship, board in silence, and the ceremony begins. MacArthur says, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." After this, the Japanese foreign minister signs the surrender treaty, followed by General MacArthur, whose hands shake according to eyewitnesses. Putting an end to the worst war in human history, and as if planned at that moment, the sun emerges as the Japanese withdraw. It is no coincidence that the surrender takes place aboard the Missouri. The ship is named after the home state of the then President of the United States, Harry Truman. A few weeks after the surrender, the ship returns to New York, where it is welcomed by thousands of people, including the President. He visits the place where the war ends, sits at the surrender table to sign the visitor's book, and describes it as the happiest day of his life. However, for the hundreds of victims, it was not so. For many, it meant a giant change in their lives. In fact, for all of humanity, it was. The world was never the same after discovering the destructive power of atomic bombs. Humanity became the first species capable of ending its own existence, altering the balance of power, generating nuclear fear and paranoia.